But the bulk of the literature still does around belonging focus on either campus-based learners, or where we do look at online spaces is often in the context of that rapid shift during the COVID pandemic, and how we could all virtually connect in those very strange times. But less research still exists about belonging in environments that were always intentionally designed for fully online learning experiences. So one of the first questions that I wanted to understand is, how do fully online postgraduate learners find belonging in fully online learning spaces? Speaking only for myself, when I was an online postgraduate learner, I was extremely transactional in my interactions. I went in, I did the learning, and I didn't value or seek a sense of community in the same way I did when I was a campus-based student. So first and foremost, I wanted to explore that question. Do our students value and define belonging in the same way in having chosen online study? From there, I wanted to explore and surface opportunities and barriers for creating whatever that desired sense of belonging might be. And then, of course, more practical elements of how we might create those environments, those desired environments for fully online learners. So to do so, I engaged with postgraduate students enrolled at the University of Leeds, completing 6 of the fully online master's programs. These cover a huge range of specialisms, ranging from artificial intelligence to disability studies to fashion marketing. All these programs are part-time, and as you can see on the slide, students, the vast majority of students were studying alongside full-time employment, alongside a whole bunch of other responsibilities, some personal, some professional. And the research project took place in 2 parts. Part 1 was a mostly quantitative-based survey, which got 47 respondents. The good news here is that those respondents were similarly spread to the enrollment numbers. So, for example, 33 students from one program answered my survey, and that constitutes about 33 of the students that are enrolled on that program across the whole student body. So in some ways, that was really exciting that the spread kind of matched the program enrollment across the board. And phase 2 utilized a relatively new methodology, which some of you may be familiar with, called listening rooms, which engaged 6 participants to explore some of the themes in further details. I'll say a bit more about listening rooms in a moment. But before I do, students learning on these programs all took a similar learning journey, in that week 1 through 6 of their program is focused on core module content, and each of those weeks has both a asynchronous discussion board and a synchronous webinar, which are kind of the main points of connection that students have with their peers, but also with their module tutor. Week 7 doesn't include any module content, so students can prepare whatever their summative assessment is, and then each module concludes Monday of week 8 when that assessment is due. So this structure also asks students to complete 10 hours of structured educator-developed learning content and 10 hours of independent study. So like I said, the kind of main points of contact and connection for students with both their peers and their tutor are that weekly discussion board and that weekly synchronous webinar. Some of these programs also include group work elements for assessment. So of course, that would be another element of connection that isn't necessarily part of every single program. So returning quickly to the listening room methodology, using this approach provides a really unique opportunity for students to reflect about experiences of belonging and hear the genuine student voice. Belonging is a really personal experience, so I really wanted a methodology to let those personal contours of belonging come to light. And this methodology was developed by Emma Heron and colleagues at Sheffield Hallam. And in her article, kind of exploring this methodology, she notes that it builds on the idea of friendship as a useful style of inquiry, and relies on guided conversations between good friends, asking them to reflect, share, probe, and question topics relating to the experience of being a student. She continued on to say that it's a method that allows them to reflect on their academic, personal, and professional development, to articulate what makes them progress or what barriers get in the way of progression, to share key moments of significance. Crucially, it provides insights into issues and aspects delineated, defined, and explained by the students themselves. For the researcher, the method provides privileged access and opens up new dimensions to what we think and we know about the student experience. So, reflecting this methodology, the researcher isn't present in the discussion space, and students are left to lead or direct emerging conversation. They participate in one of these sessions with a friend or a close peer. In the case of this research, they did so with a course mate, someone else studying on the same program as them. Participants are provided with a thematic prompt to guide their discussion, but the actual content and flow of that discussion is entirely up to participants. So following an initial briefing, making sure everybody's happy with what to expect for the session, the researcher leads that room and the students and the participants lead that conversation entirely on their own. So the resulting data comes in a form of a transcript of that discussion that can then be analyzed through a range of qualitative methodologies. But for this research and with anything with belonging, I also wanted to capture those equally valuable voices of students who either didn't feel or students that didn't value a sense of belonging or didn't identify a peer or hadn't made a connection with a peer that they could put themselves forward to participate with. So the project also included monologuing sessions as an option. These use the same prompts and the same structure as a listening room, but rather than having a conversation with a peer or a friend, participants just kind of reflected their own thoughts aloud. And these monologues proved to be a surprisingly fruitful source of qualitative data, even though it was just one student kind of speaking to the ether, if you will, in a session alone. So one of the first things the research demonstrated put one of my initial questions to bed almost immediately. It demonstrated that fully online postgraduate students do overwhelmingly desire a sense of belonging. But again, perhaps unsurprisingly to a lot of us in this room, they also experience feelings of isolation during their degree program. And despite the unique nature of fully online learning spaces, there are underpinnings of belonging that do seem to transcend campus-based and online spaces. So this word cloud asks participants to note up to 10 words that came to their mind when they thought of their sense of belonging to the institution or to their course. We see some very similar terms here, like connected, friendly, discussion, and supportive, that would be relevant in any learning environment, but also some unique online learning spaces, such as that reference to distance and webinars. And in particular, this research for me revealed 3 spaces of connection. So firstly, and maybe the most obviously, students identified their formal learning spaces as a location for where belonging was, or crucially was not, established. Similarly, participants also reflected that their personal spaces provided a foundation for belonging. These predated and extended beyond the course of study, seeking and receiving support from partners, from family, from coworkers. However, this research revealed a third middle space, which I refer to here as informal academic spaces. I've represented these here with a series of bubbles because the research really demonstrated that these provided the most important locus of belonging for students who did desire to feel that sense of belonging. But much like the bubbles, these moments are quite intangible and hard to capture. They're often unique and temporary and transitional, and they collide and intersect as well as exist individually. So within these kind of 3 spaces, participants defined belonging in a range of ways, but they were all related to this idea of belonging as being a visible part of their online learning environment and a desire to overcome that anonymity that's really easily afforded by online spaces. So for the rest of the session, I'll talk about 3 key drivers for how students defined an ability to positively impact the learning of others, how synchronous and asynchronous spaces are facilitated, and their perception of mattering to the university as an institution. At its most basic level, participants spoke about defined belonging as feeling that their presence has a purpose, with one student reflecting, "What matters to me most is feeling that my presence is needed and makes a difference among my peers. It's not only because of my contributions, but also because I am part of the group," which they defined as their program. I found this a really powerful reflection, as it reflects that desire to be tangible and embodied in an online space, and suggests that participants encounter a sense of belonging when they've had that opportunity to rise from that anonymity from online spaces and make visible, positive contributions to the learning. Relatedly, opportunities to engage with lived experience of others provided an avenue to feel a sense of belonging. It was really interesting to see that 56% of my participants agreed that it was more important to have learning materials that reflected lived experiences than content developed by academic experts. And some participants, like the one quoted here on the slide, welcomed engagement with lived experience more broadly, while another participant specifically noted that learning from their peers and the different industries that they came from allowed that student to feel their own sense of belonging and ability to share their own professional experiences. Beyond the lived experiences, participants did also seek connection via the tools structured into the program. Again, in these programs, that would be the webinar and the discussion board. However, while we can see here that 64% of students sought that connection through discussion boards, the picture of participants who found the type of connection that they valued is a much more mixed picture. And indeed, this disconnect meant that sometimes a tool conceived of to some extent as a primary source of connection for students actually had the opposite effect. This participant reflected powerfully that their sense of belonging was actually negatively impacted by their engagement with discussion boards, as they felt that they were, quote, literally talking to a wall, creating a sense of isolation in the learning space. They importantly also acknowledged that lots of people may have read what they wrote, but there was a lack of visible engagement, which meant they couldn't confidently feel like they were seen or that they had that opportunity to be valuable. And given the discrepancy between the desired aims of discussion boards and student experience, I'd propose what we're seeing here as an example of participants seeking informal connection in that third space, thinking back to our fleeting bubbles, but using a tool designed primarily for formal academic spaces. Participants did identify that disconnect and did seek that informal connection through other platforms. Every participant acknowledged that their course mates had set up some sort of alternative platform in Slack or through WhatsApp. And in doing so, they sought those additional opportunities to make and feel their presence had value, even if only, as this one participant commented, to acknowledge the shared challenges and to support one another through their program. So how do we create a sense of belonging through our asynchronous tools? Participants had some important reflections here, and I think it comes with some promising guidance that many of these opportunities to feel their presence is valued comes from the small moments rather than large-scale changes to our design. So the participant here reflected on moments where their module leader recommended reading or future program content because of ideas they'd expressed in their contributions. Other participants similarly reflected on the ways that these small moments, like replying to emails or receiving feedback on their work, allowed them to feel a sense of belonging. One participant noted, for example, that I feel valued when I get feedback from course leaders to see that you have understood the material and that your opinion is valued. So thinking about the importance of small moments, there's some good news here in the context of student engagement with Mottle staff. Survey results indicated that while participants felt that it was their module leader's responsibility to make them feel valued, the relationships that they had with academic staff broadly met these needs across all 6 programs that I looked at. It's worth noting that this relative agreement, I think, isn't a result of some sort of specific department-wide initiative or focus on specifically improving belonging. It rather reflects the ongoing efforts of individual module leaders and a kind of the application of effective learning design practices. So it suggests for me that, like the small moments that participants reflected on, we have vital opportunities for creating a sense of belonging already existing within the structures and approaches that we use to design our programs. So while discussion boards provide an opportunity for asynchronous connection, it's the weekly webinars led by module leaders that provide the primary opportunity for synchronous connection. And participants throughout the research reflected on the importance of these spaces for belonging. As one participant put it, making contributions in webinars that prompted input and questions and interest from other people makes me feel like I've added something to the discussion. In those moments, I felt like, yes, this is where I should be at the moment. This is a productive and useful place for me to be and also for the people here, which I think is a really, really powerful statement from that student. One further takeaway from student reflections on synchronous webinars is perhaps unsurprising, that the educator's approach to facilitating synchronous spaces had a key role to play in students' sense of belonging. But vitally, this also connects with dimensions of creating inclusive and equitable learning spaces for our learners. And I'll just talk about 2 of those dimensions of equity briefly now. So participants highlighted both the digital divide and the potential for the fast pace of online conversations to privilege more dominant voices. In both of these instances, those with faster processing time, either digital or human, were perceived to have more opportunities to contribute to synchronous conversations and therefore add more value to the learning of others. In thinking about the digital divide, participants in this listing room reflected on how one of the participants had a consistently unreliable internet connection, which led to barriers to their contributions in faster paced online discussions. But as we can see from the quote, it wasn't that the student didn't have very valuable, relevant things to say. It was just that their connection didn't allow them to contribute to the fast moving discussion. And with many online programs attracting learners from around the world, I think this is a finding that particularly struck me as one that might lead to replicating potential power dynamics around the global digital divide. Similarly, participants reflected on the module leader needing to have the confidence to hold space for all voices rather than just the dominant ones. For one participant, quoted on the slide on the right, not doing so felt as though this implied that the module leader or the wider cohort wouldn't be interested in their contributions. And that they continued on to reflect that this created an inequitable environment as it privileged students with quicker processing time or students who felt more confident in providing verbal contributions. And again, I think there's some important equity dimensions here to consider, including the ways that this might disadvantage neurodivergent students, learners with English as an additional language, or students from historically marginalized backgrounds. However, again, there's good news in the small moments. Participants through the research highlighted the importance of discussing the mundane to create connection. In campus-based environments, to some extent, these things just happen in the corridor before a lecture, or in the queue at the coffee shop. However, the much more time-bound formal structures of online sessions mean that these don't just happen in the same way in online spaces. So as contradictory as it might seem, maybe part of creating a sense of belonging for our fully online learners is to intentionally create space for these connections around the mundane to flourish. Finally, and perhaps most surprisingly for me, was the importance that participants indicated in mattering to their university as an institution. So as we can see here, survey data suggests participants valued a sense of connection and belonging to Leeds as an institution, even though they were studying from well beyond West Yorkshire. About 56-60% of participants were not based in the UK or Europe. So will be very unlikely to ever travel to the campus itself. And if we think back to the same question where the module leader was at the center, we can see that in this study, students placed more onus on the institution at 62%, rather than on their module leader at 49% to create that sense of being valued. Again, though, we can see here that belonging comes from the small moments. A participant here reflects that being able to attend online sessions wearing a university hoodie would have enhanced their sense of belonging. Whereas another student commented that they always wished they'd bought some kind of university branded merchandise. But they say that that kind of material probably would have been great for a sense of belonging in my office, for example, or my house, to just have a hoodie or a notebook or a pen. Here again, in a different way, we see the urge to feel like their presence add value and overcome that invisibility of the online and learning experience by being part of that institutional community. Another participant here noted that despite receiving university comms around activities of the Students' Union and other campus goings-on, their status as an online student made them feel a sense of unbelonging when they couldn't engage with some of these activities, or indeed most of these activities. So a quick win then perhaps is to ensure that where events allow for virtual attendance, these are made more visible to fully online learners. In an ad hoc conversation with a colleague following this research, Leeds is known for its peregrine falcons, and he suggested that maybe even just signposting that our distant students could watch the falcons alongside the rest of the UK would be a way to foster this sense of belonging. So, by way of conclusion, my abstract kind of boldly promised a refreshed and nuanced understanding of mattering and belonging in online learning environments. I'll leave it up to you to decide if I've achieved that. But I wanted to pause here to reflect on some of the specific contours of online belonging. So this research has demonstrated that while some of the themes of campus-based, face-to-face belonging efforts overlap, the online learning environment has a unique nature that needs to be actively considered when thinking about how to create a sense of belonging for our fully online learners. Specifically, students perceive that they matter and perceive that their presence adds value. when they have opportunities to overcome the ease with which we are able to remain invisible in online spaces. They find a sense of belonging in the small moments, but these small moments often require intentional curation in learning design, facilitation approaches, and institutional support. So a few recommendations have come out of this research. Explorations into how to create online spaces for those informal academic connections, to create those bubbles, would provide an important and valuable avenue towards enhancing a sense of community for belonging in distance learners. Facilitating synchronous and asynchronous spaces has the potential to significantly impact students' sense of belonging. Module staff should be supported to translate and adapt their practice into fully online learning environments and this different context of teaching and learning. And then finally, students value a sense of connection to the institution in relatively equal measure or more than to experience a sense of belonging in their cohort. So there's opportunities here at both the module and institutional level to realize this hope. And thank you very much. And I'm happy to take any questions.